David, the first couple of questions here, I just wanted to focus on sharing with our listeners the idea of, what is transformational leadership? And then, how can you embrace transformational leadership for successful change? And now I'd like to slightly switch gears and maybe focus on this idea of identity development. So, in other words, how can you cultivate effective ERP change leaders through identity development? So, my next question then is, how can organizations foster the development of effective organizational change leaders? What does that look like?
Yeah, I think it could look like a lot of different things, actually.
Yeah.
But I think the ones that are more effective are the ones that happen in Zito. They happen in the grip. They happen along everyday experiences, not sending people off to programs per se. It's really using ongoing work to help them develop the kinds of skills needed to be more effective kinds of leaders.
Mm.
So identity is important in this regard. And it's really a resource allocation issue.
Mm.
If you think about yourself as a leader, you're going to look for opportunities to learn and practice your leadership more often on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, whenever those opportunities, those leadership moments arise. If you don't think of yourself as a leader, then those opportunities are going to be wasted. The things that happen to you, which could be pivotal in your development as a leader, won't be internalized. So it's this notion of thinking is for doing. If you think of yourself as a leader, you're more likely to be doing things to further your development as a leader. And all of this is really couched in the notion that, who owns leader development? And my perspective is each individual leader owns their own development.
Mm. Such an interesting, I'm going to borrow that quote, leadership development is a resource allocation issue.
Absolutely.
Maybe I paraphrased you there a little bit, but
No,
that,
no.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the resources. I mean, our most precious resource is our time and our attention,
Hmm.
and where do we direct these things? So
Hmm.
if we think of ourselves as leaders, we're going to at least have part of our identity as a leader. I'm not saying the complete identity of any individual needs to be that of a leader, but we know identities are multifaceted, multidimensional. If you have room in that space to think of yourself as a leader, you're going to be allocating some of those resources around time and attention to better developing yourself to be a more effective leader.
Mm. So it really comes down to, I just, what's the word I was thinking? It's intent. It's an intentful mindset to be a leader. It's a deliberate mindset of leadership.
Yeah, I like
Yeah.
that. I think it's very
Yeah.
much around intention and
Yeah.
this notion of, if you're going to develop as a leader, it just doesn't happen.
Yeah.
You've got to put in the hard yards. You've got to put in the practice. You've got to put in the time to learn in order to be a more effective leader of any stripe.
Yeah. So just to dig a little bit deeper on that, David, obviously in your research, you emphasize the importance of leader identity. And so, how does one's identity as a leader impact their performance and effectiveness? Is it really as simple as identifying, Jack is just saying, hey, Jack, you're a leader. So, therefore, be mindful of that in terms of your resource allocation with, as you said, David, your time and effort? I mean, is it as simple as that? Is just being deliberate? Is that what it means? Is that how your identity helps you become a better leader in terms of performance and effectiveness?
Sorry to interrupt there,
No.
Jack, but I think you put your finger on a very important question and one that we don't fully have answers to, which is it just thinking of yourself as a leader? And it's probably not that simple. One of the things that has driven my research over the years is looking at trajectories of development. That is, rather than just looking at pre-post kinds of things, pre some intervention, post intervention, and how either identity or effectiveness have changed. Trajectory research is looking at longitudinal changes over time. And one of the areas that we focused on is how does effectiveness as a leader, as rated by other people, change as a function of seeing yourself as a leader? And
Mm.
we've noted that there the two important things. One is this notion of effectiveness and development tend to co-vary. That is, as people develop effectiveness as a leader, they also develop identities as a leader. But the
Mm.
other important thing that we've taken away from some of the research studies we've done is that it's not a linear function. It's much more of a J-shaped function where there are initial declines in both effectiveness and identity strength that over time start to accelerate in a positive fashion. So initially, people are challenged both in terms of their effectiveness as well as their identity as they engage in leader development kinds of interventions or leader development kinds of practices. So one implication is taking a slice of that trajectory too early may show that actually leaders are declining in their effectiveness and their identity. But actually, if you extend the research over longer periods of time, you see something that's much more positive and also linear in
Mhm.
terms of development and identity.
That's very fascinating idea there, and this idea of trajectory. I'm just trying to think through that response here, but this idea of trajectory research and leadership as seen by other people, which David, I assume that that's through some sort of survey.
Well, yeah, the research that I've been involved with in terms of trajectory analysis I mean, one of the advantages of it is that you have different sources rating different things. So,
Hmm.
but yeah, it is based on primarily on survey ratings. But for example, one of the papers that you had mentioned looked at the ratings of leadership effectiveness on different competencies as rated by their leadership coach in a 5-month intervention. Whereas identity is always going to be self rated. I mean, I can't tell you what your identity is as a leader, nor can you tell me what
Yeah.
my identity is as a leader. It's really to what extent I believe I endorse or internalize a leader identity and what is the strength of that identity.
Yeah. So really, it's a perpetual relationship and maybe proportional, right? That at least if I identify it as a leader, and if I have the desire to be a leader, that's going to mean that I'm going to allocate my time, allocate my resources, and be deliberate and being intentional about being a good leader. I'm going to want to learn how to be a good leader, study it, understand it, look at common denominators amongst good leaders. But in turn, that's going to most likely make you become more and more of an effective leader. And then the more effective you are, the more effectiveness you have as a leader, the more your identity as a leader grows. And I would imagine that's because you have the more experience and more confidence, and that snowball just keeps growing and growing.
Yeah, it is definitely a reciprocal relationship. And one of the takeaways from that is that more effective leaders in terms of being rated by other people in terms of whatever skills or competencies are at the focus co-vary with this identity strength issue. So people who have lower identity strength tend to be rated lower in terms of their effectiveness as a leader
Hmm.
on various competencies, and vice
Hmm.
versa. Those that are higher on identity tend to be seen by others as stronger in terms of their leadership competence.
Hmm. So, David, what would you say are some strategies or best practices, let's say, for individuals looking to strengthen their leadership skills and identity, and maybe particularly in the context of ERP implementations? What are some of the tactical advice maybe that you can offer? Obviously, it's your resource allocation and taking the time and effort, but what else can you offer in terms of just tactically becoming a better leader?
Yeah, I think when we talk about leadership development, it's really about using experience to develop, but all experiences aren't equally developmental. So, how do you identify those experiences or those challenges in everyday work life that can help spark your development as a leader? One way to do that is to look at three components of an experience. So, to what extent does an experience provide assessment, challenge, and support? Now, the assessment piece doesn't have to be a formalized assessment that people do in terms of like a self assessment or some sort of self ratings. It's do you get feedback from the experience about how you're doing? Also, the second piece is, how challenging is this experience? Nobody develops when they're comfortable. And that makes it difficult for some people to own their development because they're looking to be comfortable rather than uncomfortable. And the uncomfortable comes with taking on challenges that have some risk that you may not succeed in them. And then the last one is support. Research has been very clear that we can take on significantly more challenge if we have support in terms, especially in terms of feedback from others about how we're doing and how we're progressing. So if we look at this notion of, assessment, challenge, and support in the environment, those are the kinds of experiences that are going to have more developmental punch. And those are the ones you want to either try to identify or actually organize in terms of promoting your own development as a leader.
Interesting. So what I'm hearing here, David, I made some notes here, but basically 4 or 5 different things, right? One is just self-reflection and assessment. I mean, taking the time to understand experiences and how you can grow and mature from that experience as a leader. One is put you in position and take challenges to become a new leader. Accept those challenges and those experiences, and then accept feedback. Ask for feedback on how you're doing. And then, of course, mentorship, coaching. And then the one thing that I would add is understanding what academia has to say about research in this area, right? Because isn't it true, David, that Jack Nestell wants to be a good leader, and I'm going to take the resources to do that. I'm going to take my time and effort, and I can do these things. I can self-reflect. I can be willing to jump in and take on new challenges. I can be willing to take some feedback. But isn't it rather simple ideas of just understanding what we talked about to kick off this conversation? And that is the idea between transactional and transformational leadership. What do they look like? What are the different types of leader attributes and abilities and styles and so forth? So isn't that an important part of that, becoming a better leader as well?
Yeah, I think that is definitely an important part of becoming a better leader is understanding what we know from science. I mean, leadership is an art, but it's also a science.
Yeah.
And we have more than 100 years of evidence-based research behind leadership. Not that we know everything, far from it, but we do know some things. And so, as an evidence-based manager or as an evidence-based leader, knowing what the science around leadership and leadership development says will make you a better performer in a leadership domain. But it's also the case that organizations of all kinds tend to have their own unique view in terms of what's important
Yeah.
as a leader. And that boils down to what is a leadership competency model in a particular organization?
Yeah.
What is it that the organization values and proposes as being the core components of what it takes to be an effective leader?
Hmm.
So, mapping on kind of the local competency model to more general kinds of leadership skills, behaviors, and competencies can help accelerate that development as a leader.
Yeah. So in other words, David, leadership is also contextual based
Very
on the
much,
context.
very much
Yeah.
contextual, and I think
Yeah.
what it takes to be effective in one particular domain. Let's just say private equity could be very different than what it takes to be successful as a leader in another domain. And let's just take higher education as an example of that.
Yeah. Yeah. Higher education versus military versus,
R-
private corporation.
Right.
They could have require very different leadership styles. We've seen it time and time again where various executives in one portfolio company, which a portfolio company is what you call a company that's owned by a private equity firm.
Hmm.
Executive may be quite successful at one portfolio company, and then so therefore assume that the success is going to follow to another portfolio company. That's not always the case, and it's very, very much so contextual.
It very much is, and we can also add to that a cultural dimension. In
Yeah.
a global environment, we often have people who are moving in an organization that is based in multiple cultures, moving from one culture to another, and it's frustrating for them to realize that what has made them successful, for example, in North America, is not making them successful in South America. And the leader needs to be attentive to cultural cues and understand that their leadership approach probably has to vary depending on the cultural context.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, leadership is a topic that, no doubt you could talk about and we could talk about for hours. But, the one thing that's interesting to me, David, is I think sometimes leadership gets much too simplified. You look at various articles and, blog posts and so forth where, hey, the key to leadership, and they list off a bullet point or two, and then
Yeah.
they build their case for why these, whether it's a style or an attribute or, whatever it may be, a skill set. but it's the key to successful leadership. And it's just drastically oversimplified. And, I do think, again, the world's just too complex, from a cultural perspective within an organization, the contextual environment, the leadership, people are all very different. And so therefore leadership and what's effective within a given context, it's not always so obvious or apparent as to what makes a good leader.
Right.
So it's just always very interesting to me when you see these, I think, quite simplified keys to successful leadership. I just think there's so much there.
Yeah, and it's also the case, especially in the leadership development space. And this is something that motivated me to get involved as a researcher, to try to better understand what are some of the fundamental tenets of leadership development. In the academic circles, we have just scores and scores of different leadership theories, and
Hmm.
none of them are completely right. None of them are completely wrong. And we could debate which ones are the better ones, or which ones are less better. And
Yeah.
you
Right.
noted transformational leadership, and that certainly has a lot of evidence behind it, but it's not the only theory out there that has some viability. But where it gets really tricky, it's not just identifying what's the right theory or the best theory of leadership, it's how do you develop it.
Yeah.
And I think there was a conventional thinking among researchers and academics was that if we just found the right leadership theory, then all we needed to do was train it. And I don't think that's the case at all, because there's a whole field of human development that's all about trying to understand how people develop across the lifespan.
Yeah.
And within that is also, people who focus on adult development. What are the kinds of things that help adults develop throughout the lifespan, even into old age? So, you know, what had happened is that there was a real divergence in the field where academics were focusing on fighting about what's the right theory of leadership, and people in the practice side kind of took over the space around leadership development. And quite frankly, a lot of bad practices developed as a result of that.
Mm.
What some have called leadertainment. That is,
Mhm.
you're just
Yeah.
having fun, you're playing games, and
Yeah.
this is supposed to develop you as a leader. But we know from adult development that the only way that people develop as adults is if if they continue to take on challenges that stretch them and move them into places that are uncomfortable rather than comfortable. So, how can that help us understand leadership development? Well, that's been part of my mission as a researcher, to try to study leadership development processes and come away with some understandings from an evidence based perspective.
Yeah. Fascinating topic. It's not just about understanding leadership, it's about leadership development.